It was 10 p.m. when David was still sitting in his office chair, the dim light of his computer screen casting shadows on his exhausted face. He was buried in performance graphs, endless reports, and a flood of emails. His body was there, but his mind wandered in a state of numbness. Everything felt automatic. Respond, calculate, plan. Work wasn't a choice anymore. It had become a prison, and time slipped away unnoticed. David was known as one of the most dedicated and efficient executives in his company. Over the past 10 years, he had climbed the corporate ladder swiftly, becoming a key player at a multinational tech company. His name was synonymous with efficiency, results, and success. But behind the flawless exterior, a growing sense of emptiness gnawed at him. The achievements, once the fuel for his ambition, no longer carried any meaning. With a heavy sigh, David shut down his computer and stared at his tired reflection in the window. Outside, the city lights twinkled, as if life was happening somewhere beyond his reach. His luxury apartment, perched high in a modern tower, offered a panoramic view, but inside, it was as impersonal as a hotel room. No personal touches, no plants, no photos of friends. Everything was functional, minimalist, and reflected his inner state. Organized, but completely devoid of life. He turned away from the window, grabbed his jacket, and headed out. The hallway in his building was silent, except for the echo of his footsteps on the polished marble floor. As he entered the elevator, a familiar weight settled on his shoulders, as if the world rested on his back. His life had become an endless series of indistinguishable days, and the deep exhaustion was a constant companion. Burnout was a term he knew, but never dared to say aloud. After all, he was the successful one, the man everyone looked up to with admiration. Stepping outside, a light rain had started to fall, casting a slick sheen on the city streets. He walked quickly along the sidewalk, wanting only to reach home, where he would sleep too late and wake too early to repeat the same cycle. But something stopped him. From a dark corner near a dumpster, he heard a soft, almost inaudible sound. A whimper? David frowned, pausing for a moment. Curious, he walked closer to the sound, and there, among soaked cardboard boxes and torn trash bags, was a dog. It was small, thin, and visibly exhausted, much like he was. The dog's fur was matted and wet, its eyes dull, but there was something in its expression, something that made David stop and look for longer than he should have. The dog looked back at him, hesitant, with a mix of fear and hope. It was as if the animal was waiting for someone, anyone, to save it from this abandonment. David felt the impulse to keep walking, to ignore the situation and stick to his routine. He didn't have time for this, but for some reason, he couldn't. For a few seconds, David stood there, staring at the dog. The rain was coming down harder now, and he knew he couldn't just leave it there. "You shouldn't be here, just like I shouldn't," he muttered to himself. Instinctively, he crouched down and extended his hand. The dog flinched at first, but then took a tentative step forward. David hesitated, but then scooped the dog into his arms, feeling the fragile weight of the creature. A strange, but not unpleasant warmth spread through him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had done something that actually mattered. He carried the dog back to his apartment, ignoring the curious looks from the doorman as he passed through the lobby. Once inside, he quickly grabbed a towel and began drying the dog off, making a makeshift bed in the corner of the living room. The dog, still wary, curled up on the far side of the room, watching David with cautious eyes, as if studying him. David, in turn, watched the dog from a distance, his mind torn between what he had just done and the mountain of work awaiting him the next day. When he finally crawled into bed, something felt different. There was something unsettling, yet oddly comforting, about having that small creature in his apartment. It was the first time in years that something unexpected had entered his life, something beyond his control. He didn't know why he had brought the dog home, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it could be the beginning of something. Sleep came faster than usual that night, and in the silence of the apartment, only the soft sound of the dog's breathing filled the empty space. The next morning, David woke up with a sense of unfamiliar calm. He wasn't greeted by the usual rush of anxiety that hit him the moment he opened his eyes. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the soft sound of paws padding across the floor. For a moment, he didn't understand what was different. Then he remembered the dog. Sitting up in bed, he glanced toward the corner of the living room where the makeshift bed was. The stray dog lay curled up, still asleep. David watched the small rise and fall of the dog's chest as it breathed softly. For a split second, he felt an unexpected sense of peace, an odd contrast to his usual morning chaos. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, rubbing his temples. The workday ahead was waiting for him, like a weight looming over his head. But something about the sight of the dog made him hesitate. He stood up, walked over to the creature, and crouched beside it. The dog's eyes fluttered open, and it looked at him, its gaze still filled with uncertainty. David sighed. "I don't know why I brought you here," he muttered. "I've got enough on my plate." The dog blinked at him, silent as if waiting for a cue. It didn't whine or bark, it just sat there, staring. David looked at his watch. He was already running late for work. The emails, the meetings, the constant demand for his attention, they all flashed in his mind. His instinct was to get up, get dressed, and dive back into his routine. But something held him back. Instead of rushing out, he filled a bowl with water and rummaged through his kitchen, finally finding an old bag of cereal bars. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. As he set the makeshift meal in front of the dog, it hesitated before sniffing the food, then cautiously began to eat. David watched, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction watching the dog consume the meager offering. Once the dog had finished eating, it seemed to relax slightly, its body language softening. David could see that the dog was thin and worn out, its fur still matted from the previous night's rain. He felt a tug of sympathy he hadn't expected. The dog reminded him of something, someone, he couldn't quite place. There was a familiarity in its eyes and the way it seemed out of place, just like him. Shaking off the thought, David got up and grabbed his coat. He couldn't stay here all day. There were clients waiting, deadlines looming, and problems that needed solving. He reached for the doorknob, his mind already shifting back into work mode. But as he pulled the door open, he paused. The dog had lifted its head and was staring at him again, its eyes silently asking a question David couldn't answer. A twinge of guilt settled in his chest as he realized he was about to leave it alone. "I'll be back later," he mumbled, though the words felt hollow. He didn't know what he was going to do about the dog. Taking it to a shelter seemed like the logical choice, but something made him reluctant to do that. As the door clicked shut behind him, David walked down the hallway, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. But unlike other days, it didn't feel as overwhelming. The image of the dog stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind as he stepped into the elevator and made his way out into the bustling city. Throughout the day, between meetings and reports, his thoughts kept drifting back to the stray dog he'd left at home. Each time he glanced at his phone or paused for a moment, the memory of those wide, uncertain eyes crept into his thoughts. Why had he felt the need to bring it inside? He could have just kept walking, like he always did with everything else in life, disconnected, focused only on the next task. But that dog, with its quiet presence, had interrupted his carefully structured routine. By the time his workday ended, David felt a strange urgency to get home. It wasn't the usual pull of exhaustion or the need to collapse into bed after a long day. It was something else, something quieter but persistent. He wanted to check on the dog, to see if it was still there, still waiting. When he finally unlocked the door to his apartment, the dog was exactly where he had left it, curled up in the same spot, though it lifted its head and wagged its tail slightly as David stepped inside. It wasn't an enthusiastic greeting, but it was enough to make David smile. He walked over, crouching beside the dog again. "You're still here," he said softly, reaching out to stroke its fur. The dog didn't flinch this time. Instead, it leaned into his hand, its eyes closing as it rested against him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, David felt something shift inside him. Something like contentment, maybe even peace. He stayed there for a long moment, his hand resting on the dog's back, feeling the rise and fall of its breathing. The world outside could wait for now. The next few days presented challenges David hadn't anticipated. Taking care of the dog turned out to be far more demanding than he'd imagined. At first he thought it would be simple. Feed the dog, leave for work, come back, repeat. But reality quickly proved otherwise. On the second morning, he was woken up earlier than usual by the sound of the dog pawing at the door. Groaning, David dragged himself out of bed and let the dog out into the hallway. It was obvious that it needed to go outside, but David wasn't prepared for this. He looked at his phone. It wasn't even 6 a.m. yet. His body ached from the constant lack of sleep, and the last thing he wanted to do was go outside. But the dog was insistent. Sighing, he threw on a coat and led the dog out into the cold morning air. The city streets were quiet at this hour, the usual rush still hours away. The dog trotted beside him, seemingly energized by the fresh air, while David shivered, wishing he were still in bed. It was a minor inconvenience, but enough to make him question why he had brought the animal into his life in the first place. Back at the apartment, David fed the dog and got ready for work. But as he rushed through his morning routine, the dog seemed to be constantly underfoot, whining, following him from room to room, never letting him forget it was there. At one point, David nearly tripped over it, spilling coffee across the kitchen counter. Frustration built inside him. This wasn't part of his plan. He had deadlines to meet, emails to answer, and clients to manage. His job demanded focus and time, and he couldn't afford distractions. He needed structure, predictability, two things the dog clearly didn't understand. Before leaving for work, he knelt down beside the dog and gently patted its head. "You're making things complicated, you know that?" The dog looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the disruption it had caused. David sighed. "I'll be back later," he muttered, not entirely sure if he meant it. At the office, David's frustration only grew. His inbox was flooded with urgent emails, and his boss had already called twice before he'd even had a chance to sit down. The pressure was relentless, and every time his mind drifted back to the dog waiting at home, he felt a pang of guilt mixed with irritation. He had no time for this. His life was already too full, too demanding. What was he thinking? Trying to take care of a stray dog? Throughout the day, he battled the rising sense of being overwhelmed. His work suffered, he missed a few key details in meetings, and one of his projects fell behind schedule. Colleagues began to notice his distracted behavior, asking if everything was okay. David forced a smile and brushed off their concerns, but inside, he knew something had shifted. He wasn't as sharp, as focused, as relentless as he used to be, and it scared him. By the time the workday ended, he was exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. His usual routine of burying himself in work until late into the evening was interrupted by thoughts of the dog. He found himself rushing home, more out of a sense of obligation than anything else. When he opened the door to his apartment that evening, the dog greeted him with a wagging tail and a few hesitant steps forward. It was an improvement from the day before. At least now, it seemed to trust him a little more. But David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't working. The dog was a distraction, a complication he couldn't afford. That night, as he lay in bed, his mind raced. He considered taking the dog to a shelter in the morning, telling himself it would be better off with someone else. Someone who had the time and energy to care for it properly. After all, he wasn't equipped for this. He had a career to focus on, a reputation to maintain. He couldn't let himself be distracted by something so small, so unimportant in the grand scheme of things. But as he turned over, glancing at the corner where the dog lay curled up, the decision felt heavier than he expected. The dog had already begun to fit into his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was small, yes, but its presence filled the empty spaces in his apartment, in his routine, spaces he hadn't realized were empty until now. David sighed, closing his eyes. Tomorrow, he'd figure it out. For now, he'd rest and hope that clarity would come with the morning. Over the next few weeks, something started to shift in David's life. The routines that had once defined his existence, work, deadlines, endless hours in front of a screen, began to fade into the background. The dog, still unnamed, had quietly but firmly inserted itself into his daily rhythm, and David was slowly, almost unconsciously, adjusting. Each morning, the dog's insistent pawing at the door woke him earlier than his alarm. At first, this annoyed him. He was used to squeezing every possible minute out of his sleep, desperate to hold on to the little rest he got. But as the days passed, the early morning walks became something he almost looked forward to. The cool air, the quiet streets, the rhythmic sound of the dog's paws on the pavement. These moments offered him something his work never had: peace. On one of these mornings, as they walked through a park not far from his apartment, David found himself watching the dog with a faint smile. The dog had become more comfortable with him, bounding ahead with newfound energy, its tail wagging as it sniffed every blade of grass and tree trunk. It was a simple thing, the way the dog explored the world, but David felt a strange sense of contentment watching it. This wasn't part of his plan. He was supposed to be running the corporate world, climbing higher, achieving more. And yet, here he was, standing in a park, watching a stray dog chase after a leaf caught in the wind. For the first time in years, David didn't feel the crushing weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He didn't feel the familiar anxiety that usually gripped him when he thought about the long list of tasks awaiting him at the office. Instead, he felt calm. As they continued their walk, David's mind drifted back to his childhood. There had been a time when he, too, had enjoyed the simple things. He remembered the dog he'd had as a boy, a golden retriever named Max, who had been his constant companion through the ups and downs of adolescence. Max had been his best friend, his confidant, the one who had always been there during the tough times, like when his father had left. David's chest tightened at the memory. It had been years since he'd thought about those days, about Max or his father. He'd buried those memories deep, focusing instead on becoming successful, on building a life that was untouchable, invulnerable to the kind of pain he'd experienced as a child. But now, as he walked through the park with this stray dog trotting beside him, those old memories surfaced, uninvited but not unwelcome. Maybe, he thought, he'd spent too long trying to run away from the past, trying to escape the vulnerability that came with caring about something or someone. Later that evening, after another long day at the office, David found himself sitting on the couch, watching the dog as it lay curled up in its usual corner. His apartment felt different now. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt softer, more bearable. The dog's presence, quiet and steady, had become something he relied on, even if he hadn't fully realized it yet. As he sat there, David's phone buzzed on the table in front of him. It was a text from his boss, another urgent message about a project that needed his attention. For a moment, David's first instinct was to jump up, grab his laptop, and dive back into work, as he always had. But he didn't. Instead, he stared at the phone, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility, but also the newfound sense of calm that had taken root in him. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, torn between the relentless demands of his job and the quiet moments that had started to bring him peace. The dog lifted its head and looked at him, its eyes calm and steady, as if sensing the inner turmoil David was wrestling with. Without thinking, David reached over and scratched the dog's head, feeling the warmth of its fur beneath his fingers. "You're changing things, you know that?" he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. The dog blinked up at him, silent as always, but its presence was answer enough. The next morning, David found himself waking up with a strange sense of purpose. He got up earlier than usual, not because of the dog's insistence this time, but because he wanted to. As they walked through the park again, he felt lighter. It wasn't just the dog that had changed. Something inside him had shifted as well. On a whim, David took a different route through the park that day, one that led him to a part he hadn't visited in years. It was quieter here, more secluded, and as they walked, David spotted an old playground in the distance. It was run down now, overgrown with weeds, but seeing it triggered a flood of memories. This had been his favorite spot as a child. His mother had brought him here almost every weekend, before things had gotten complicated with his father. It was where he had spent hours running around with Max, laughing and carefree. It was where he had felt safe, before the world had taught him otherwise. David stopped walking, the dog pausing beside him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the playground, feeling a mixture of nostalgia and sadness wash over him. How had he let himself drift so far from that boy? How had he become so consumed by work, by success, that he'd forgotten what really mattered? The dog nudged his leg, breaking him out of his thoughts. David blinked, looking down at the animal. The dog was staring up at him with those same calm eyes, as if reminding him that the past didn't have to define him, that he could still change. With a deep breath, David turned away from the playground and continued walking, the dog trotting happily beside him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the things that truly mattered. As David's life began to shift, so did the demands of his job. The projects at the company were piling up, and the pressure from his boss had become almost unbearable. Every day, more meetings, more deadlines, and more expectations were being placed on his shoulders. But something was different now. His mind, once razor-sharp and always focused on work, was increasingly drawn elsewhere, to the quiet mornings with the dog, to the walks in the park, to the moments of stillness he hadn't realized he needed. The dog had become an integral part of his life, but it wasn't without its challenges. Every morning he had to wake up earlier to walk it, and every evening he found himself rushing home, torn between the demands of his work and the responsibility he'd taken on with the stray. The carefree dog, with its wagging tail and innocent eyes, seemed oblivious to the strain it had introduced into his carefully managed routine. Then came the day when David's boss called him into his office. The tone of the conversation was tense from the start. "We're looking at a major promotion opportunity here, David," his boss began, leaning forward over his desk. "But it's going to take a higher level of commitment, more late nights, more focus on meeting our quarterly goals. We need someone who can give everything." David nodded, though his stomach twisted. He had worked his entire career for this moment, a chance to move up, to earn the recognition and success he'd spent years chasing. Yet, for the first time, he felt a hesitation, a reluctance to say yes without thinking. His boss continued, "You've always been our go-to guy, and I have no doubt you can handle this, but I've noticed lately you seem distracted. Is everything okay?" David froze. It was true. He had been distracted, not only by the dog, but by the way his life was changing in unexpected ways. He was no longer the same person who had lived solely for work. But how could he explain that to his boss? How could he admit that the simplicity of caring for a stray dog was making him question everything he'd built his life around? "I'm fine," David said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my plate." His boss nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I hope you know how important this promotion is, David. We're counting on you. Don't let anything get in the way of your potential." The words echoed in David's mind long after he left the office. Don't let anything get in the way. But what if the thing getting in the way wasn't a distraction, but a realization? What if it was the first sign that his life needed to change? Later that evening, as David sat on the couch with the dog at his feet, he couldn't stop replaying the conversation in his head. The promotion was everything he had worked for, everything he thought he wanted. But now, with the dog curled up beside him, it didn't feel as satisfying as it once had. The constant pursuit of success, the endless hours spent at work, it all seemed hollow compared to the small but meaningful moments he had begun to experience outside of the office. He looked down at the dog, which had grown healthier and more confident under his care. The dog looked up at him, its eyes warm and trusting, and David felt a pang of guilt. How could he even consider abandoning this new part of his life, just to climb the corporate ladder? The next morning, as they walked through the park together, David's mind raced with questions. Could he really turn down the promotion? Could he sacrifice his career, everything he had worked for, just to keep a dog and a sense of peace he hadn't even realized he was missing? It felt absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the promotion wasn't the answer. Not anymore. That day at work, David tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting. The pressure was mounting, and as the hours ticked by, he found himself feeling more and more cornered. His colleagues were already talking about the promotion as if it were a done deal, congratulating him in advance. But David felt no excitement, only dread. By the time he left the office that night, his decision had started to take shape in his mind, even if he wasn't fully ready to admit it to himself. When he got home, the dog greeted him with its usual quiet enthusiasm. But there was something different this time. Something in David's posture, in the way he moved through the apartment, that made the dog hesitate. Sensing the tension, the dog followed him cautiously, as if waiting for some kind of signal. David collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. How had his life become so complicated? It was supposed to be simple: work hard, succeed, repeat. But now, with the dog and the moments of calm it had brought into his life, everything felt upside down. He sighed, leaning back and looking at the ceiling. He needed to make a choice, one that would change everything. He couldn't keep living this double life, torn between the high-pressure world of his career and the quiet, peaceful moments he had found with the dog. But how could he walk away from the promotion? How could he give up on the one thing he had been chasing for so long? David glanced down at the dog, which had settled by his feet, its head resting on its paws. It looked up at him with its calm, steady gaze, and something in that look gave David the clarity he had been searching for. He had been chasing the wrong thing. All these years, he had thought success was the answer, that the next promotion, the next raise, the next achievement would fill the emptiness inside him. But now, with this dog beside him, he realized that it wasn't success that he needed. It was peace. It was connection. It was something deeper than the shallow victories he had built his life around. The decision was clear. He knew what he had to do. The days following David's decision were filled with an uneasy sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do, but it didn't make the weight of the choice any lighter. The looming promotion, the expectations at work, and the shift in his own priorities had created a new kind of tension in his life. One he was still grappling with. But through it all, the dog remained his constant companion, grounding him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Then, one morning, everything changed. It started like any other day. David woke early to the sound of the dog pawing at the door, ready for their usual morning walk. But as he reached for the leash, he noticed something was wrong. The dog didn't seem as eager, its movements slower than usual, its body language subdued. David knelt down beside it, gently placing a hand on its back. "You okay, buddy?" he asked softly. The dog didn't respond with its usual tail wag or bright eyes. Instead, it lay down on the floor, breathing shallowly. Panic surged through David's chest. He knelt beside the dog, gently stroking its fur, trying to calm both the animal and his own rising fear. "This isn't right," David muttered to himself. The dog, usually so full of quiet energy, now seemed lethargic, barely lifting its head. Without wasting another second, David scooped the dog into his arms. It felt lighter than he remembered, as if some of its strength had drained away overnight. His heart pounded as he rushed to his car, carefully placing the dog on the passenger seat. He could feel his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. The drive to the vet's office was a blur of anxiety. David kept glancing over at the dog, hoping for some sign of improvement, but it just lay there, its breathing slow and labored. Every second felt like an eternity, and by the time he arrived at the clinic, David's nerves were frayed. The receptionist at the front desk immediately sensed the urgency in his voice as he explained the situation. Within minutes, a veterinarian appeared, ushering them into an examination room. David hovered near the door, watching as the vet carefully examined the dog, checking its vitals and running her hands over its thin frame. "What's wrong with him?" David asked, his voice tight with worry. The vet glanced up, her expression serious. "It's hard to say without running some tests. It could be a number of things. An infection, something internal. We'll need to do blood work and possibly an X-ray to figure out exactly what's going on." David nodded, feeling helpless as he watched the vet work. The dog lay still on the examination table, its eyes half closed, clearly exhausted. David's chest tightened as he realized how deeply he had come to care for this animal. The thought of losing it was unbearable. The next few hours passed in agonizing silence as the tests were conducted. David sat in the waiting room, unable to focus on anything but the dog. His phone buzzed with messages from work, more deadlines, more demands, but he ignored them. None of it mattered right now. Finally, the vet returned, her expression somber but not hopeless. "It looks like your dog has an infection," she explained. "It's treatable, but we'll need to act quickly. The good news is that he's strong enough to respond to treatment, but it will require medication, fluids, and careful monitoring over the next few days." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with the realization of what came next. The treatment wouldn't be cheap, and it would require time. Time he wasn't sure he could afford with the demands of his job. The vet handed him the estimate for the cost of the treatment, and David felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he looked at the numbers. It wasn't that he couldn't afford it. He could, thanks to his high-paying job. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the choice he had to make. The treatment would require him to take time off work to dedicate his energy to caring for the dog during its recovery. And with the promotion looming, he knew this would complicate everything. David stared at the paper in his hands, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could easily say no, take the dog to a shelter, and walk away. It would be the logical choice, the one that allowed him to focus on his career, to secure the promotion he had worked so hard for. But as he looked down at the dog, lying weak but still breathing on the examination table, he knew he couldn't do it. This dog had become more than just a stray he had taken in. It had become a part of his life, a companion that had brought him peace and purpose when he had needed it most. Walking away now would feel like abandoning the only real connection he had made in years. "I'll do it," David said quietly, handing the estimate back to the vet. "Whatever he needs." The vet smiled, nodding in understanding. "We'll start the treatment right away. You've made the right choice." As David watched the vet begin the treatment, a sense of calm settled over him. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. The dog had saved him in ways he hadn't fully realized until now, and now it was his turn to return the favor. Over the next few days, David took time off from work, something he had never done before. His colleagues were shocked, his boss even more so. But David didn't care. He spent those days caring for the dog, administering its medication, and making sure it had everything it needed to recover. Each day the dog grew a little stronger, its eyes brightening, its tail wagging more enthusiastically. And with each passing day, David felt something inside him shift. The promotion no longer mattered. The relentless chase for success felt distant, unimportant. What mattered now was the quiet moments with the dog, the peace he had found in caring for something other than his career. The crisis had shown him what he needed to see, that life wasn't about climbing higher or achieving more. It was about finding meaning in the small, quiet moments. And as he sat beside the dog, watching it slowly regain its strength, David knew that he had found exactly that. The dog's recovery, though slow, was steady. As the days passed, the infection began to subside, and its energy returned little by little. David had never felt more relieved. He watched as the once lethargic animal now moved around the apartment with newfound confidence, wagging its tail whenever he approached. Each time their eyes met, David felt an unspoken understanding between them, a connection deeper than he had ever expected. During this time, David's life began to shift in ways that were hard to ignore. He found himself waking up not to the relentless pull of deadlines or the stress of meetings, but to the quiet presence of the dog by his side. His days were no longer defined by the pressure of achievement, but by simple, meaningful moments. Morning walks in the park, afternoons spent at home, and quiet evenings with his new companion resting at his feet. At first, David thought this would just be a temporary break from his old life, a pause before he returned to the grind. But as the days stretched into weeks, he realized he wasn't eager to go back. The urgency he had once felt to climb higher, to be the best, to prove himself to everyone, it had all faded into the background. He didn't miss it. One morning, as he stood by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the dog sniff around the apartment, David's phone buzzed. It was a text from his boss. "We need to talk. The promotion decision is coming up. Let me know when you're ready to get back to it." David stared at the message, feeling the weight of the decision he had been putting off. The promotion, the one thing he had worked for his entire career, was still there, dangling in front of him like a prize he had once desperately craved. But now it felt like something he no longer wanted, at least not in the same way. He had spent years chasing success, thinking that once he reached the top, everything would fall into place. But now, standing in the stillness of his apartment, with the dog looking up at him with those calm, steady eyes, David knew the truth. He had already found what he was looking for. It wasn't the promotion. It wasn't the recognition or the prestige. It was the peace he felt now, the sense of purpose that came from caring for something beyond himself. It was the quiet moments he had rediscovered, the memories of his childhood, and the connection he had built with the dog that had become a part of his life. That afternoon, David made a decision. He picked up the phone and called his boss. As it rang, he felt a strange mix of nerves and relief. When his boss answered, David could hear the tension in his voice, the impatience. "David," his boss began, "I've been waiting to hear from you. This promotion is huge. You've got to make a decision. Are you in or not?" David took a deep breath, glancing down at the dog, which was now resting at his feet. "I appreciate the opportunity," he said slowly, "but I've decided to step back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Step back? What does that mean?" "It means I need to focus on my life outside of work," David explained, surprised by how calm he felt as he said it. "I've been thinking a lot, and I realize I've been chasing something that doesn't really fulfill me anymore. I need to take a break, figure out what really matters." His boss didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone was a mix of disbelief and frustration. "David, this promotion is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You've worked for this for years. Are you sure you're willing to walk away from it?" "I'm sure," David replied. "I've found something more important to me now." Another pause, then a curt, "Well, I can't say I understand, but if that's your decision, we'll respect it. I wish you the best." The call ended, and David stood there for a moment, the silence of the apartment wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. He had done it. He had walked away. And instead of feeling regret, he felt something else entirely: freedom. In the days that followed, David started to rebuild his life, but this time on his own terms. He reduced his hours at the company, taking on fewer projects and leaving behind the relentless pursuit of success that had once driven him. He spent more time with the dog, whose health had fully recovered by now. They explored new parts of the city, wandered through parks, and even ventured into quieter, more peaceful areas where David had never thought to go before. One afternoon, during one of their walks, David came across a small animal shelter. The sign out front caught his eye: "Volunteers needed." He stopped, looking down at the dog, who seemed to sense his hesitation. "Should we check it out?" David asked, half joking. The dog wagged its tail, and David smiled. Without overthinking it, he walked inside. The shelter was a modest place, filled with the sounds of barking dogs and the soft meows of cats. A volunteer greeted him warmly, explaining how they were always looking for help, whether it was walking the dogs, organizing supplies, or just spending time with the animals. David felt a pull he hadn't expected. He hadn't volunteered in years, hadn't done anything outside of work, really. But something about this place felt right. Over the next few weeks, David began spending his free time at the shelter. At first, it was just a few hours here and there, walking the dogs or helping with paperwork. But as he got to know the staff and the animals, he found himself becoming more and more involved. The work felt meaningful in a way that his corporate job never had. It was simple, yes, but it was real. The shelter became a new part of his routine, and soon, David found himself speaking with the director about how he could contribute more. They needed help organizing events, raising funds, and spreading awareness about animal adoption. It was work that required skills David had honed in his corporate career. But now, he was using them for something he genuinely cared about. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, David sat on the couch, the dog curled up beside him as usual. He looked around his apartment, at the life he had built, not the one filled with corporate achievements and status symbols, but one filled with meaning, peace, and connection. He had never expected a stray dog to change his life. But now, as he sat there, feeling more content than he ever had, David realized that this was the life he had been searching for all along. The dog stirred beside him, lifting its head to look at him with those familiar, trusting eyes. David smiled, reaching down to scratch behind its ears. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he was thanking the dog, himself, or the universe. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had found his way. In the weeks and months that followed, David's life took on a new rhythm, one defined not by the hectic demands of corporate life, but by purpose, balance, and the quiet moments that had come to mean so much. The promotion he had once chased with such fervor became a distant memory, a path he no longer regretted turning away from. In its place, he found fulfillment in the small, meaningful connections that now shaped his days. The dog, now a permanent fixture in his life, had become more than just a companion. It was a symbol of the changes David had made. Proof that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to profound transformation. Every morning, the two of them would walk through the park, where the once busy executive now found solace in the simple beauty of nature, in the soft rustling of leaves and the quiet company of his loyal friend. David continued volunteering at the animal shelter, but his involvement had deepened. His background in business had become an asset, and he was soon helping the shelter with fundraising events, organizing outreach programs, and even working on adoption campaigns. The work gave him a sense of purpose he had never found in the boardroom. It was tangible, real, and it made a difference. One day, as David was helping with an adoption fair, he struck up a conversation with a woman who had come to adopt a dog. She had been through a difficult time, recently laid off from her job, struggling to find direction in her life. As they spoke, David couldn't help but see a reflection of his own journey in her story. "It's funny," she said, as they watched her newly adopted dog play in the grass. "I thought I had everything figured out, but now I'm starting to realize that maybe I needed a change all along." David smiled, nodding in understanding. "It's amazing what these animals can teach us, isn't it? They remind us of what really matters." The woman looked at him thoughtfully. "What about you? How did you end up here?" David paused, glancing down at the dog resting at his feet. It was a question he had asked himself many times, but now the answer felt clear. "I was chasing something I thought I wanted," he began, "but I didn't realize how empty it was until I found something more meaningful. This dog," he gestured toward his companion, "helped me figure that out. I thought I was saving him, but in a way, he saved me." The woman smiled softly, and they continued to talk, sharing their stories of unexpected turns and the lessons learned along the way. By the end of the conversation, David felt a deep sense of connection, not just with her, but with the journey they had both taken to get to this point. As the adoption fair came to a close, David found himself reflecting on how far he had come. His life, once defined by ambition and success, was now measured by the impact he was making, the relationships he was building, and the peace he had found within himself.